Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that might seem a little strange at first. What do Hitler and Fidel Castro have in common?
Hmm.
Beyond the obvious, like the dictator mustache, the fondness for those really long speeches, these two guys, they were separated by decades and continents, but they shared a challenge, figuring out how to consolidate their power by controlling the workforce.
Right.
So we're going to analyze, well, it's this history lecture comparing their tactics in Nazi Germany and revolutionary Cuba. We'll see how they handled labor unions, worker rights, even leisure activities.
It is a fascinating comparison. On the surface, you have this brutal fascist regime and then a communist revolution, right? Two totally different ideologies.
Totally.
But both Hitler and Castro, they both understood how important the working class was.
Exactly. It's like that saying, you want to understand a society, watch who they celebrate and who they silence. And these two leaders, they knew whoever controls the workers pretty much controls the whole country. So let's start with Hitler's Germany. I think a lot of people, when they think about the Nazis, they think immediate brutality. But their initial approach to labor was, well, more cunning than you might expect.
Right. This is where you get that idea of intentionalism in history, this perspective that these leaders, they had everything planned out meticulously. With Hitler, there was definitely some calculated deception going on. Like, take May Day 1933, for example.
Okay.
The Nazis, they organized these huge celebrations for International Workers' Day. It was all to make everyone think they supported workers' rights.
So it's almost like they were trying to, lull the unions into this false sense of security. Like, hey, maybe these Nazi fellows aren't so bad. Maybe they like picnics and parades, too.
Exactly. But that facade, that whole we're all about worker solidarity act, it crumbled overnight.
Oh, I bet.
Literally the next day, May 2nd, 1933, stormtroopers, those guys, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing.
Yeah, known for their violence.
Exactly. They stormed union offices all across Germany, arrested the leaders, seized all their funds. Just like that, it was over. The German trade union movement, which had been so powerful, was basically dismantled.
Wow. It's kind of incredible how fast Hitler flipped the script on them. Went from pretending to be their friend to this ruthless oppressor like overnight.
It was fast.
But then he had to replace those independent unions with something else, right? That's when the German Labor Front comes in.
Right, the infamous DF.
Free!
But we should be clear about one thing. This was no workers' union, not really.
Right.
It was just a way for the Nazi regime to control every single thing about the workforce.
Every single thing.
And it wasn't just about like how much people were getting paid or how much stuff factories were pumping out either.
Oh, no.
No. They even tried to control workers' free time with this program called Strength Through Joy.
Strength through joy. Okay, in the context of Nazi Germany, that sounds, almost Orwellian. Like, come on, comrades, let's all enjoy this mandatory fun. Or else, really, they thought they could control how people were spending their free time.
Well, yeah, that was the goal. The DF, they organized everything, vacations, cultural events, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all about pushing Nazi ideology and basically crushing any kind of independent thought.
Wow.
It's a crazy example of how totalitarian regimes, they don't want to just control the physical labor of their citizens. They want to control their minds and spirits too.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it like that. So did any of these workers see through this whole charade? Or were they really just so, beaten down, so afraid? Did they just go along with it?
That is the million-dollar question. Historians are still debating that today. Well, yeah. Some historians say that a lot of workers were initially drawn to the Nazis because they were promising economic revival and national unity. And this was during a time when unemployment was really high and there was a lot of social unrest in Germany.
So you could see how some people might think, hey, maybe these are the guys to get us out of this mess.
Exactly. So from that point of view, it's less about Hitler as this evil mastermind and more about the historical and economic conditions that let him come to power in the first place.
Right, right. So it's less about Hitler and more about the circumstances.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of the structuralist view of history is really important. Looking beyond the individuals and thinking about the bigger societal forces that are at play.
Okay, so we have Hitler's Germany. We've got calculated deception, followed by, well, brute force. But what about Castro? He came to power saying he was this champion of the working class. So how did he balance that with, actually staying in control? How did he appear to empower the very same people who put him in charge while at the same time, holding all the cards?
Well, Castro's approach, it's really interesting when you compare it to Hitler's. Because unlike the Nazis who just came in and took over everything by force, Castro went with a more subtle strategy. He co-opted the existing labor unions instead of just destroying them completely. And
Interesting.
you have to remember, the Cuban Revolution had a lot of support from the urban working class. They were really unhappy with the Batista regime.
Right, Fulgencio Batista, he was the dictator in Cuba at the time.
That's the one.
So Castro basically used all that pre-existing resentment, that anger towards Batista, to his advantage.
Exactly. He took the existing unions and he brought them all together under the Confederation of Cuban Workers.
Which everyone calls the CTC.
Yeah, the CTC. But here's the thing, and this is important. He made sure the CTC leadership, the people in charge, were all his people.
Yeah.
His loyalists. Smart move, right?
Yeah.
Gets rid of the Batista loyalists, puts his own people in charge. It was a way to neutralize any potential pushback, any dissent from within the labor movement itself.
Wow, sneaky. But it sounds like a really tough balancing act, you know? Trying to consolidate your own power while making people believe you're this champion of the workers. So did Castro actually make things better for them? Or was it all just for show?
No, he actually implemented some real reforms. Things like, better wages, safer working conditions, even programs to try to get rid of unemployment.
Okay, so he wasn't all talk.
Right, and these moves, they really resonated with the Cuban people because, let's face it, they'd been through a lot under Batista, a lot of economic hardship.
Right, so it's like that classic carrot and stick approach.
Yeah.
Offer a few genuine improvements, keep most of the workers happy, but always with that unspoken threat in the background.
Exactly.
Step out of line and, well, you'll be dealing with the CTC, which answers to me now.
You got it. And Castro, much like Hitler with his strength through joy, he understood that it's not enough to just control people with force. You have to appeal to something bigger, something they feel a part of.
So it wasn't just about material benefits for Castro. It was about this whole idea of the revolution.
Right.
Right.
Right. It was about making people feel like they were part of this huge historical movement that was going to totally transform Cuban society.
And that's where something like that 1970 sugar harvest comes in, I bet.
Exactly.
That crazy goal of producing what was it, 10 million tons of sugar?
An impossible target, some would say. Millions of Cubans were mobilized for this thing.
The scale of it is just mind-boggling. Do we know if they ever actually hit that target, or was there something else going on there?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's something that historians still go back and forth on.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Was it a genuine effort to, boost the Cuban economy? Or was it more about, unifying the population under this common goal? Solidifying Castro's own leadership? It was probably a bit of both, to be honest. But it's a perfect example of how Castro used these huge mobilization efforts, not just to increase production, but to shape national identity, create this sense of we're all in this together.
Wow. So we've got Hitler, who's all about brute force, right? Crushing any opposition. And then we've got Castro, who takes a more, nuanced approach, maybe even manipulative, right? Co-opting existing power structures instead of destroying them. But when you really get down to it, were they really that different? Both of them, through their own methods, they managed to silence anyone who disagreed with them.
That is a really sharp observation, and it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about today. How do we make sense of these leaders who seem so different on the surface, but are actually using similar tactics?
Right.
If we look at things from the perspective of revisionism, which is a school of thought in history, it could be argued that ideology wasn't really the driving force for either Hitler or Castro.
It was more about practicality.
Exactly. It was about pragmatism. What did they need to do to hold on to power and maintain stability? For Hitler, that meant getting rid of any potential threats.
And for Castro, it meant controlling those threats, making sure they were on his side.
Exactly. Two sides of the same coin.
Oh.
And this is where the post-revisionist perspective comes in. They're looking at the long-term impact of all this. And post-revisionists would say that, yeah, controlling labor was absolutely crucial for both these regimes. Whether they did it through violence or through manipulation, it allowed them to stay in power for decades.
That's kind of a scary thought, the idea that control equals power.
It is.
But it also makes you realize how resilient people can be, even when they're living under these oppressive systems.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the strength of the human spirit, people finding ways to resist, to hold on to hope, even in the worst situations.
It's true. And studying these historical figures, even though it can be, disturbing, it helps us learn from our mistakes.
Right.
If we understand how people have been manipulated and controlled in the past, we can recognize it when it happens today. we know what to look out for.
Exactly. It's like that saying, those who can't learn from history are doomed to repeat it or whatever. But maybe there's a more, I don't know, a more positive way to think about it. Like, neither Hitler nor Castro, they couldn't crush the human spirit entirely. People always want to be free.
That's right. Their regimes lasted for a long time, but in the end, they crumbled. And after that, we saw incredible things for the people who survived those systems.
Yeah, you're right. It really makes you wonder, are there tactics being used today to manipulate and control people, things that we don't even realize are happening?
Those are the questions we all need to be thinking about.
For sure. And that's what's so interesting about history. It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present and even the future.
I agree.
Well, we are out of time for today's deep dive.
Hey.
A huge thank you to our history expert for taking us through all of this.
Happy to be here. It's always a good time to dig into these historical debates.
Always. To everyone listening, until next time, keep asking the tough questions and stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.